Hi, my name is Jay Sugarman, and I want to welcome you to Museum Open House. This ongoing series features and highlights many of the outstanding museums and other cultural institutions. The main purpose of most programs is to inform viewers about current and upcoming exhibits, various programs, resources, and other opportunities that are available for the general public. Today, via Zoom, we're fortunate to have as our guest Jeff Richmond-Moll from the Peabody Essex Museum. Jeff serves as the George Putnam Curator of American Art, and he was one of the co-curators of the current outstanding exhibition entitled Edmonia Lewis, Set in Stone. This is the first major museum retrospective of the work of Edmonia Lewis, one of the most remarkable and historically underrecognized 19th century American sculptors. During the program, we'll learn why and how the exhibition came about. We'll go on a behind the scenes tour and in the process come to better understand and appreciate how Edmonia Lewis navigated her racial, cultural, and gender identity through art during a time when mainstream American institutions marginalized both Black and Indigenous artists. Let's start by meeting Jeff and then hearing all about Edmonia Lewis, Set in Stone, which is on display until June 7th. Welcome, Jeff. So delighted you're able to be here.
Thanks, Jay. Great to speak with you.
It's great to see you again. And first of all, just congratulations to you and your colleagues for curating yet another must-see exhibition at the Peabody Essex Museum. Eager to hear much more about it and have you inform viewers. But before we jump right to that, could you briefly remind us just a little bit about your background and what your current position entails, please?
Sure. Well, I'm the George Putnam Curator of American Art here at the Peabody Essex Museum, which means that I oversee 4 centuries of American art and cultural expression, painting, sculpture, works on paper, and just that means working with our collection, working on exhibitions like the Edmonia Lewis show to really think through, the stories that we continue to tell about our American past and present, and that artists help us understand about our American future.
Let's move ahead. And for those first not familiar with Edmonia Lewis, would you please start by telling us a little bit about her and why she's now considered a central figure in American art?
Sure. Edmonia Lewis was born in 1844 in upstate New York in a little town near Albany. And she was orphaned as a child, raised by her maternal family, who were Mississaugas of the Credit. This is a First Nation, currently, surrounded by present-day Ontario and Canada. She learns from a very young age what it means to be an artist, to have a creative vision through her maternal aunts who are, fellow artists and makers. And then through the support of her half brother Samuel, who plays an instrumental but quite under-recognized role in supporting Lewis throughout her life, she is able to attend several educational institutions that are established in the mid 19th century for educating women and people of color in that time. Probably most well known to us today is Oberlin College in Ohio, where Lewis spends several years in this preparatory program, which is essentially established to educate and train teachers. Unfortunately, she experiences prejudice and several traumatic, even violent events at Oberlin where she's wrongfully accused twice and cleared twice
Hmm.
of those charges. But she meets during her time at Oberlin the great abolitionist and orator Frederick Douglass, who recognizes her talent
Hmm.
and encourages her to seek the East. This is what Douglass writes in 1873, recalling 10 years earlier meeting Lewis at Oberlin. And so that's what she does. She goes east from Oberlin, uh, ends up in Boston, Massachusetts in 1863 and embarks on her professional artistic career. She resolves to become a sculptor, and within 2 years, she has created a network of patrons, a body of sculptures, which we'll talk about, I know, to support her move from the United States to Europe, to Rome, Italy, the center of the kind of sculptural world in that
Mhm.
time. And really just sort of this incredible rise that she is able to achieve through her savvy as an artist, through her skill, through her sort of self-possessed, self-aware ability to kind of navigate, as you mentioned, the prejudices of her own day, the expectations people had about as a Black and Indigenous woman, what she could and could not do. And really, her story, in a lot of ways, is a story of overcoming, of what we talk about, these ideas of resilience and transcendence that thread through Lewis's own story and also thread through the subjects of her sculptures.
Most definitely. Why and how did Pem go forward with displaying, creating this incredible display of her work?
Well, to your previous question too, there really had not been a major survey exhibition of Edmonia Lewis until this exhibition. There had never been an opportunity to gather her work together across the breadth of her career, and so first of all, we felt like that was that was important. It was important for us to really see Lewis's artistic career in its fullness, to honor the full breadth of her creative vision from, you know, uh, as I said, really from her childhood through, Boston and Rome, um, and her work has received this kind of groundswell of attention in recent years, within the last couple of years. But it's also we're sort of at this moment where we've also only just learned certain basic facts about her. And
Hmm.
so the the fact that her gravesite remained unmarked until 2018, when a
Uh,
grassroots campaign successfully raised money to place a proper headstone on her grave in London, where she died in 1907. So, we sort of felt this obligation too, that in light of this really marvelous artist and this powerful story that was waiting to be told, that is, continually unfolding in terms of sort of what we can understand about Lewis. This was a really important thing that the museum, in partnership with the Georgia Museum of Art, our co-organizer on the project, could do to really to bring her work together for the first time.
Terrific, terrific. For those who haven't had a chance to visit yet, we're fortunate to have a selection of images that'll provide us with a behind the scenes tour rather quickly compared to what you'll enjoy when you make the trip to Pem. But let's start with this section here that we encounter, anti-slavery and emancipation. What's highlighted as we go through?
Well, the exhibition is divided up into several sort of thematic galleries that trace the progress of Lewis's artistic career. Really the beginnings of her career as a sculptor are her beginnings in Boston in 1863, where she seeks out a sculptor named Edward Brackett, whose portrait of John Brown we see in that back left corner there of the installation view, an artist who she knew for making this really famous portrait of Brown, the fiery abolitionist, who Lewis saw as a hero for African Americans. And this space is anchored. Each of the three main sections of the gallery of the exhibition are anchored by a major work by Lewis. This space is anchored by Lewis's Forever Free, which you see there on the right. And the gallery looks at the importance of art and activism as kind of an entwined project for Lewis. but specifically in Boston in 1863, we're at the height of the Civil War in the United States. Boston is a hotbed of anti-slavery activism, and Lewis feels like as she arrives in Boston as an artist of color, she has a really powerful point of view to offer in the midst of these debates that are swirling about abolition, about the future of the American nation. And that's what the gallery really sort of puts into context. The communities Lewis builds, the patrons that she is able to develop, all of which eventually leads to this sculpture, Forever Free, which is her sort of ultimate statement about freedom. It's a sculpture of a man and a woman who, unlike other images about emancipation at this time, this this African American man and woman are shown freeing themselves. They are the agents of their liberation. They break their own chains. And I think as you know, as the first sculpture celebrating emancipation by a Black
Mm.
artist in this country, that is what makes Lewis's statement so powerful.
Most definitely. You know, before we move on, how significant were her portrait medallions of abolitionists in building her reputation?
Oh, incredibly significant. I think we have to sort of understand the iconic status of individuals like Abraham Lincoln, Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, who becomes a martyr for the Union cause as the leader of the Massachusetts 54th Regiment. This is one of Lewis's earliest portraits. Wendell Phillips, who you see here, a really influential abolitionist and orator. And what this shows very early on is that Lewis could really she could advance her career by making sculptures of these sort of well-known figures of the day and sort of meeting these market demands, which is something the sort of savviness of Lewis as both an artist and entrepreneur is really important in understanding her. But what Wendell Phillips, who we might not know as well today, was a really vital figure in the abolitionist movement. And what these were purchased by Lewis was going around to various anti-slavery societies and selling these portrait medallions to raise money. She was receiving commissions for portraits. They were sort of her bread and butter, like any sculptor
Mm.
of the day. And making and selling works like that were a means to then have the resources to go out on a limb and make a work like Forever Free, which is sort of a speculative endeavor for Lewis. She makes it without
Mm.
a patron because she feels convicted that a sculpture like this needs to be made. The other thing I'll mention just briefly with the Wendell Phillips is these portraits also tell us about other audiences and networks of Lewis's in Boston who aren't often part of the conversation. And specifically, Lewis makes a plaster version of Wendell Phillips when she's in Boston in the 1860s, which ends up in the dorm room of a man named Richard Greener at Harvard College, who is the first Black graduate of Harvard.
Mm.
And so to think about Lewis's work not only of white abolitionists for white abolitionists, but also for members of her, the fellow members of the Black community of Boston. And thinking about an Edmonia Lewis sculpture in a freshman dorm room is also sort of mind blowing. But
Yes.
Richard Greener being just such an important figure within Black Boston and highly influential in Black culture in the decades that follow, his connection to Lewis really kind of opens up the stories we can tell about her and the impact of her art as well.
Well, thank you. As we continue, very important section, Indigenous artistic worlds, gives us insight into how Lewis's Anishinaabe background heritage influenced her work. Just a couple words on that, please.
Sure. Well, so Lewis in 1865 moves from Boston to Rome. And by 1866, she begins work on these sculptures inspired by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's poem, The Song of Hiawatha, an incredibly popular poem, internationally famous. Longfellow himself, famous, on both sides of the Atlantic. And one of those sculptures you see here is Hiawatha's Marriage, a scene from that poem. Um, Lewis's move to Rome, we wanted to make the case that, it's while, this is the first time that she's beginning to engage with Native culture and Native subject matter as an artist of Anishinaabe ancestry, moving to Rome was not a moving away from her sort of North American roots and the world that sort of nurtured her creative vision from childhood, which, as I mentioned in the beginning, was her maternal family. And so we wanted to think about, how Lewis is approaching not just Longfellow's poetry about Native peoples, but creating a kind of new visual culture around Native peoples, Native communities, that has a direct connection to her own indigenous ancestry. And so this gallery puts those Longfellow sculptures into conversation with other indigenous art, that, the kinds of things that Lewis, as a child in the 1850s, would have been making herself. She, in interviews later in her life, she talks about making moccasins and weaving and making beadwork. And so here on this slide, you see some of the things from our collection that we put into conversation with a sculpture like the Old Arrow Maker on the left there, which
Mm.
is a sculpture about the passing of artistic knowledge in a way from one generation to the next. The arrow maker on the right is the father of Minnehaha, the figure on the left there in Longfellow's poem. Both of them are shown in the act of making. The arrow maker, as his name suggests, is carving an arrow. Minnehaha is weaving a mat of rushes on her lap. It's a picture of intergenerational knowledge being shared. It's a picture of a continuity of generations. And it sort of speaks, we think, to Lewis herself, being nurtured as an artist by learning a number of different artistic practices from her own ancestors, her own foremothers. Really, whereas I think in the past, Rome has been sort of understood as a departure for Lewis, we see this as all connected.
It's the inclusion of these cultural and historical artifacts that truly enriches, enhances, adds such a robust nature to the overall exhibition, in addition to highlighting, of course, Edmonia Lewis's work. You mentioned Studios of Rome, and fortunate to have this section again, which just is so typical of the richness of Pem's exhibition, to go behind the scenes and hear, learn about sculpting. A few words about this section, please.
Well, leading into the studios of Rome, thinking about Lewis's experience, learning from a young age how to be an artist, how to be a maker, and also how to market herself as an artist, because she would have traveled to tourist art markets as a child with her maternal family. So the move again to Rome and the space of the studio, which is very much a tourist space. The Lewis's studio was in guidebooks at the time that American and European travelers could read and learn, okay, what artists
Mm.
do I need to go meet? What studios should I visit? We
Uh,
don't typically think about the studio as a public space, as a space that people were passing through. But for Lewis, it was very much a place where she was both producing her art and performing her artistry, for a market. And so the studio space becomes a really great opportunity to think about both of these things together. It also is a great chance, because I have to admit myself, I didn't fully understand what it meant to make a marble sculpture until I started studying Lewis in greater depth. But the old arrow maker, which we saw in the previous slide, and which you see here on the screen, Lewis makes 6 versions of that marble sculpture. Well, how is that possible? How can marble, I think we look at and we say, this
mm.
is we have this myth about marble, passed down from these stories about artists like Michelangelo, who were said to, take a block of stone and free the figure from the block.
Mm,
Um, Marble is actually a reproducible medium for artists like Lewis in this time, because of the steps involved in making marble sculpture that make it reproducible. So on the left, you see how, in collaboration with Skylight Studios, our colleagues in Woburn, Massachusetts, they sort of walk us through the three main stages of making a sculpture in marble. From the left, modeling the work in clay, creating this kind of refined maquette model for the artist to use in the studio enterprise. That clay model is then cast in plaster. That you see a plaster version of the old Air Maker
mhm,
at the center with the mold broken in half behind it. Images of the plaster casting process on the screen to its left, and then artists and artisans that they employed in their studio would have used that plaster sort of like a photographer uses the negative of a
mm,
photograph to print multiple versions. An artist could use the plaster as a way of making multiple versions in stone, and it's just through a kind of a mechanical process of moving from plaster to stone and back and forth, taking measurements and gradually carving away the figure from the block.
mhm.
Um, but what that also helps us understand is that Lewis commanded a really uh, impressive enterprise by the 1870s. She employed up to 20 assistants in her studio
Wow.
who were
Mm,
helping her make all these different versions of, her Longfellow sculptures, even as she also was getting portrait commissions, continuing that work, and then thinking, okay, well, what's next? And in 1876, she famously debuts this monumental sculpture, The Death of Cleopatra. And it's only because she, in spite of the expectations of the day, which basically, it was thought that a woman artist was not physically or intellectually capable of making sculpture, um, and that an artist of color, like Lewis, the prejudices and preconceptions she was working against. Her work is sort of a logical impossibility in the kind of white imagination of the day.
mm.
And yet, she was incredibly successful and, as I said, commanded the space of her studio, to such a successful degree.
You mentioned a little earlier how she became an artist. What's highlighted in this section?
Yeah, well, the how Edmonia Lewis became an artist phrase, it's sort of there's multiple meanings here. We've been talking all along about, how was it that Lewis went about gaining the artistic expertise to become a professional artist. But this phrase, how Edmonia Lewis became an artist, is drawn from a pamphlet that Lewis publishes about herself, because Lewis is using photography, like this range of portrait photographs that she sits for,
Mm,
in various places like Boston and Chicago and even Rome. And she's also using the press, newspaper coverage, and print culture to assert her artistry, to assert her presence in the international art world. Edmonia Lewis became an artist because she insisted that she was one, is sort of the answer to that question. She
mm,
insisted that she be seen as a legitimate artist, whether, those three photos on the right taken by Henry Roche in Chicago, where she's dressed in the part. Roche was famous for being a photographer of stage performers and theater performers in Chicago. And so Lewis here, it looks like she's just stepped out of her studio into Roche's photography studio, in the middle of carving a sculpture. But, this is performance in the sense of, using the medium of photography to, like Frederick Douglass, whose, name came up before, who also used photography to overcome prejudice and assert this sort of subjectivity and humanity of African Americans in the 19th century. Lewis is doing the same thing to insist that, and assert that she is an artist worthy of her place on the world stage.
No, definitely. Just as you were speaking, Frederick Douglass and his use of photography and their association definitely came to mind. Only a couple of minutes left, maybe just a very brief word on how faith intersected with activism in her art.
Well, towards the end of Lewis's career, she begins to make work largely focused on religious themes, mythological subjects, figures from antiquity. I mentioned Cleopatra. Here we're looking at Hagar, who was an enslaved Egyptian woman to Abraham and Sarah in the book of Genesis in the Old Testament. But while those sculptures have often been seen as sort of a departure from the rest of her work, we really see these as inherently connected with these notions of activism that thread through Lewis's career, and particularly images of powerful women, uh, images that seek to uplift the marginalized, the disenfranchised. Lewis herself, and we feature quotes throughout the exhibition from Lewis. She says, she speaks of the sympathy that she's always had for all women who struggle and suffer. And I think in these sculptures, and sculptures like the ones you see here, which are a little more allegorical, you see these um, little babies who are awake and asleep, which are sort of these meditations on mortality, life, and death, and hopefully new life and resurrection, which are maybe more palatable to her Protestant audiences, her Protestant buyers. Lewis herself is Roman Catholic, and she converts to Roman Catholicism after she moves to Italy. But that sincere religious faith that is at the heart of Lewis's lived experience also makes itself present through her sculptures in the ways that her work is really committed, like Forever Free, which is a celebration of freedom, liberation, of family and community. Longfellow sculptures, likewise, these works are, an insistence on liberation, on the promise of freedom through a kind of spiritual language that she really focuses on towards the end of her artistic career.
I know there's another section, tribute to her legacy with Gisela Torres and others' work. But in closing, Jeff, how would you like visitors to leave the exhibition? What would you like them to take from having this wonderful opportunity to learn about Edmonia Lewis?
Well, yeah, the exhibition really ends, through the work, as you said, of Gisela Torres, but also more generally with this kind of meditation on uh, how Lewis as an artist is forgotten by the mainstream art world. And we talk about that as sort of a selective forgetting because there are also many others who continue to remember her. The role in this country of Black artists and scholars and community organizations who kept Lewis's legacy alive in spite of the fact that she was so often forgotten and then rediscovered and remembered and forgotten again. And so we kind of leave the exhibition with this thought about what is our obligation as fellow carriers of memory, right? As people who have who having come through this exhibition about Edmonia Lewis, an artist whose memory deserves to be preserved. What is our responsibility in remembering her, and also in remembering others whose important contributions to our culture have often been forgotten?
Mhm. Well said, well said. Well, there's much more for visitors and others to see. In addition, a sensational catalog that you and colleagues have put together about the exhibition about Ammonia Lewis. Highly recommend that. But Unfortunately, Jeff, we've come to the end of the program. I want to thank you once again for taking the time and providing this wonderful overview, so insightful of the current exhibition. Continued success with future endeavors.
Thank you so much.
Also, want to thank those of you watching for joining us and hope you'll be able to tune in next time.